Today's activity is called Making Inferences Using Flashback. We will be using flashbacks from chapters 1 through 5 of The Giver by Lois Lowry to make inferences or draw conclusions based on evidence. At the end of this lesson, you will be able to examine and interpret literary flashbacks in order to make your own conclusions. Previously, we took notes on key reading skills. The reading skill that we will use today is making inferences or reading between the lines. When you make an inference, you use clues to figure out the meaning of ideas that are not directly stated. When you do this, you're using your own knowledge and experience to figure out something that's not written right on the page. You act like a detective, using clues to make guesses about what might be true. Today, we're going to be using flashbacks to look for clues and make guesses about what might be going on in the story. Flashbacks occur when the writer goes back to material that happened prior to the beginning of the story or earlier in the plot sequence. Flashbacks give readers background information that's needed to understand the story. This can take the form of anecdotes, and it can come from the narrator or characters. Remember, anecdotes are short, self-contained stories. They might have a beginning, middle, and end, but the characters aren't very well developed, and neither is the setting. The story is mainly used to make a point. Let's look at the first flashback in The Giver. The first flashback in The Giver is the pilot in training's mistake. This is on pages 1 and 2. It was almost December, and Jonas was beginning to be frightened. No, wrong word, Jonas thought. Frightened meant that deep, sickening feeling of something terrible about to happen. Frightened was the way he had felt a year ago when an unidentified aircraft had overflown the community twice. He had seen it both times. Squinting toward the sky, he had seen the sleek jet, almost a blur at its high speed, go past, and a second later, heard the blast of sound that followed. Then one more time, a moment later, from the opposite direction, the same plane. At first, he had been only fascinated. He had never seen aircraft so close, for it was against the rules for pilots to fly over the community. Occasionally, when supplies were delivered by cargo planes to the landing fields across the river, the children rode their bicycles to the riverbank and watched, intrigued, the unloading and then the takeoff directed to the west, always away from the community. But the aircraft a year ago had been different. It was not a squat, fat-bellied cargo plane, but a needle-nosed, single-pilot jet. Jonas, looking around anxiously, had seen others, adults as well as children, stop what they were doing and wait, confused, for an explanation of the frightening event. Then all of the citizens had been ordered to go into the nearest building and stay there. Immediately, the rasping voice of the speakers had said, "Leave your bicycles where they are." Instantly, obediently, Jonas had dropped his bike on its side on the path behind his family's dwelling. He had run indoors and stayed there, alone. His parents were both at work, and his little sister, Lily, was at the child care center where she spent her after-school hours. Looking through the front window, he had seen no people, none of the busy afternoon crew of street cleaners, landscape workers, and food delivery people who usually populated the community at that time of day. He saw only the abandoned bikes here and there on their sides. An upturned wheel on one was revolving slowly. He had been frightened then. The sense of his own community, silent, waiting, had made his stomach churn. He had trembled. But it had been nothing. Within minutes, the speakers had crackled again, and the voice, reassuring now and less urgent, had explained that a pilot in training had misread his navigational instructions and made a wrong turn. Desperately, the pilot had been trying to make his way back before his error was noticed. "Needless to say, he will be released," the voice had said, followed by silence. There was an ironic tone to the final message, as if the speaker found it amusing, and Jonas had smiled a little, though he knew that what a grim statement it had been. For a contributing citizen to be released from the community was a final decision, a terrible punishment, an overwhelming statement of failure. After reading that flashback, we can come to a conclusion about some of the things that we read. When you make an inference, it's like putting together the pieces of a puzzle. If we look at these puzzle pieces, the first two are clues from the text or the evidence that we are citing. The last puzzle piece is the conclusion or the meaning of these clues. The first clue that we can pull out of this reading is that Jonas and the other members of the community obeyed the voice of the speakers when it told them to leave their bicycles and immediately go into the nearest building. Later, the voice on the speaker said that the pilot would be released for mistakenly flying over the community. This was a terrible punishment for a contributing citizen. We can conclude that mistakes and disobedience are not tolerated in Jonas's community. We are making an inference here because nowhere in the text does it say that mistakes and disobedience are not tolerated. We can use evidence from the story to figure this out. Let's look at another flashback from page 3. In this flashback, Jonas is scolded for using the word released in a playful way. Even the children were scolded if they used the term lightly at play, jeering at a teammate who missed a catch or stumbled in a race. Jonas had done it once, had shouted at his best friend, "That's it, Asher, you're released," when Asher's clumsy error had lost a match for his team. He had been taken aside for a brief and serious talk by the coach, had hung his head with guilt and embarrassment, and apologized to Asher after the game. Here, we see a couple of things happening. First, Jonas had jeered at Asher when his clumsy error had lost a match for his team, saying, "That's it, Asher, you're released." Later in this flashback, Jonas had been taken aside for a brief and serious talk by the coach for the remark. Jonas had felt guilty and embarrassed and apologized to Asher after the game. So, what can we conclude about release? From this, we can conclude that release is shameful and seen very negatively for members of Jonas's community. This last flashback is when Asher accidentally uses the word distraught instead of the word distracted. If you'd like to read this flashback, go ahead and pause the video and read it to yourself. For this flashback, I have given you one of the clues or one piece of evidence from the text, and I've told you what we can conclude. I need you to figure out one more piece of evidence that helps us reach the conclusion. So the piece of evidence that I have given you is that Asher had to stand before the class and give the standard apology to his classmates for being late. The conclusion is that conformity and uniformity are very important to the people of Jonas's community. What else in the flashback supports this? In the flashback, we see that the teacher takes Asher's language error very, very seriously. The teacher takes the language error so seriously that the teacher stops the prescribed lesson to go over what it was that Asher had said and what he should have said. This supports the idea that conformity and following rules and uniformity and doing things the same way are very important to the people of Jonas's community. Once your teacher has assigned roles to each member of your group and gone over the cooperative group work procedures with you, you're going to complete this activity. Before completing the activity, please be sure to put the names of your group members on the appropriate lines. The directions on this activity ask you to, in your groups, complete the puzzles below using the flashbacks indicated for each puzzle. You may use a copy of the book while completing this activity. Each completed piece of the puzzle is worth 4 points. For the first flashback, which is Lily's telling of feelings on pages 5 and 6, you are given the 2 pieces of evidence and you need to come to a conclusion or make an inference about those pieces of evidence on your own. Remember, when you make an inference, you're making a conclusion that isn't directly stated in the text. For the next flashback, Father's telling of feelings, on pages 7 through 8, you are given 1 piece of evidence in the conclusion. You need to find 1 more piece of evidence that supports that conclusion or inference. For the third flashback on this activity, which is Mother's telling of feelings on pages 8 and 9, you are given the first piece of evidence. You need to find another piece of evidence or something else that happened during this flashback and then make an inference or come to a conclusion about what this information might mean about the community. On the last page, there are 6 different flashbacks listed. Your teacher will circle one for your group, and you will be completing this puzzle for that flashback. You will need to cite 2 pieces of evidence that help you come to a conclusion or make an inference about Jonas's community. If you finish early, please take a look at the extension questions on the bottom of the last page. Discuss those questions in your groups after finishing the activity, and be prepared to share what you've discussed with the rest of the class.